I want to do a video this time as a reaction to someone else's work, but this time not a video, this time a book. And it's really part of a broader critique on my whole problem with scientific knowledge, or scientific as we have come to understand it. And compare and contrast this with the essential Christian model. So I want to do Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, as this thing that I wish to address, which is an account of how scientific knowledge unfolds within history. For anyone that has read the book, its central claim is that science does not proceed through linear accumulation of facts, but through what he says, or he calls paradigms, which are shared frameworks that define what counts as legitimate knowledge, what methods are acceptable, and what constitutes a valid solution. Now, a paradigm in Kuhn's sense isn't merely a theory, it's a comprehensive matrix that includes theoretical commitments, methodological standards, instruments and practices, and exemplars that guide problem solving. Now, scientific activity, therefore, moves through structured phases. In periods of normal science, researchers operate within a paradigm, solving puzzles it defines, not questioning its foundations. Over time, unresolved anomalies accumulate, producing crisis, which may culminate in a scientific revolution wherein a new paradigm emerges and reorders the field. The transition isn't merely additive, but transformative. Kuhn famously describes competing paradigms as incommensurable. They employ different concepts, standards, and even perceptions of what counts as a fact. Because of this, there's no neutral paradigm, independent tribunal by which competing frameworks can decisively be judged. Instead, paradigms are compared by values such as explanatory power, coherence, predictive success, and especially scope, which is the range of phenomena a framework can account for. Yet these values themselves are applied within paradigms, not from outside them. And this is where the model becomes philosophically decisive. For Kuhn, all knowledge is mediated through historically situated, humanly constructed frameworks. Evidence is never encountered raw. It's always interpreted through the categories of a paradigm. What counts as a phenomenon, what qualifies as an experiment, what constitutes repeatability, all are internally defined. This produces an implicit but powerful restriction. Reality, as knowable, is limited to what can be assessed through spatio-temporal interaction, measurement, and repeatable experimentation. Now, this restriction is not argued for. It's assumed as the condition of scientific intelligibility. Yet Kuhn's own account depends on meaningful comparison between paradigms, particularly through the notion of scope. A new paradigm is said to be superior because it explains more phenomena, more coherently, or with greater unification. But this introduces a tension. If paradigms truly define their own worlds, then the field over which scope is measured is not stable. What counts as a phenomenon shifts within the framework. In that case, greater scope cannot mean access to more of the same reality. It reduces to internal reorganization. But scientific practice does not treat it this way. It treats expanded scope as a deeper grasp of reality itself. This implies a continuity of reference that transcends paradigms, a reality not constituted by them, but increasingly disclosed through them. Kuhn's model relies on this implication, but can't justify it. It oscillates between historical relativity and implicit realism without resolving the tension. The limitation becomes decisive when confronted with a form of knowledge that does not arise from within a paradigm at all. Now, Kuhn's framework cannot account for a mode of knowledge whose authority is neither generated nor validated within a paradigm. The messianic prophetic word, the oracular word of God, introduces precisely such a category. The prophetic word is not a hypothesis, nor an inference from observed regularities. It's a prior declaration that establishes in advance a structure of meaning that becomes intelligible in its fulfillment. This is not a prediction in a probabilistic sense. It's determinative speech in which the event is bound to the word that precedes it, like in Isaiah 46:9 through 10. Now here, verification operates according to an entirely different logic. In Kuhn, confirmation is 1. Internal to a paradigm, 2. Dependent on repeatable experimentation, and 3. Governed by shared methodological standards. In the prophetic word, confirmation is diachronic, unfolding across temporal distance, singular yet cumulative. Each fulfillment is not repeatable, yet participates in a coherent pattern, and 3. Self-authenticating in structure, arising from the correspondence between word and event. The evidential force lies not in controlled repetition, but in the convergence of a prior declaration and later realization, like Luke 24:44. The temporal distance between the two is not a liability. It is essential to the form of knowledge being disclosed. This yields a mode of knowing that is trans-temporal. It occurs within history, yet is not derived from historical processes. It is given into time, yet its authority is not conditioned by temporal succession. At this point, Kuhn's system reaches a boundary. If all knowledge is paradigm-bound, and all paradigms are historically situated, then no knowledge can claim authority beyond its framework. But the prophetic word of which I speak does precisely this. Its intelligibility does not depend upon the standards of any given paradigm. Rather, it exposes those standards as insufficient to account for what is presented. This is not merely an alternative interpretation. It's a redefinition of what counts as evidence. A paradigm may attempt to reduce prophetic fulfillment to coincidence, literary construction, or retrospective imposition. But such restrictions do not arise from greater explanatory scope. They arise from a prior restriction of admissible reality, one that excludes in advance any form of disclosure not mediated by experimental repeatability. So the prophetic word does not compete with paradigms, it judges them. It reveals that the criteria by which paradigms measure scope, coherence, and validity are themselves partial, not constructed within a bounded field that excludes the very phenomenon under consideration. Moreover, the prophetic word introduces a unity that Kuhn's model cannot generate. Paradigms fragment knowledge into successive, revisable frameworks. The prophetic word, by contrast, establishes a coherent trajectory in which prior declaration and later fulfillment form a single intelligible pattern. The end discloses the meaning of the beginning. So here, the word scope is transformed. It's no longer the breadth of phenomena accounted for within a methodological domain, but the capacity to account for reality as structured by divine intentionality across time. A paradigm may achieve maximal explanatory success within its field, yet remain fundamentally incomplete if it can't recognize this dimension. And finally, the prophetic word is not merely epistemic, but authoritative. It doesn't await validation by a community. It establishes the standard by which communities and their paradigms are measured. This reverses Kuhn's structure. In Kuhn, the community stabilizes the paradigm. In the prophetic word, the disclosure itself confronts and reorders the community. So now, conclusion. Kuhn's model successfully describes how humanly mediated knowledge develops within history, but it also confines knowledge to that mode. A system that defines all admissible evidence as paradigm bound cannot recognize a form of truth whose authority does not arise from those bounds. It cannot adjudicate a disclosure that is not generated within its structure. Now, the messianic prophetic word represents such a disclosure. Now, it is not paradigm bound, not experimentally repeatable, and it's not temporally confined in its authority, but revealed through fulfillment that binds word and reality across time. Kuhn explains how paradigms change. He does not account for how reality may disclose itself in a way that stands over them. And it's precisely there where knowledge is no longer constructed within a framework, but recognized in the correspondence between divine declaration and historical fulfillment, that his model reaches its limit. Now, of course, the upshot of all of this is going to be from the side of atheists or agnostics that basically God is just an illusion. It's just a product of the self, a product of the imagination and speculation. You have no proof for this God. And so they're basically saying that it's just an illusion. And by extension, transcendence as defined as something that enters our dimension from above, that breaks in from above, which leaves some of itself here that we can examine and infer this transcendent reality does not exist. But you have to turn this around on them. And it's very easy to do. Because, what scientific knowledge basically is doing, in one sense, it's doing a very good thing, and I am radically attached to it. We have to demand evidence. We have to expect. There is some example that exists in spatio-temporal reality that evinces the object that we propose to actually exist and be true. This is an absolute necessity. And this is the good thing about science. The problem without science, it restricts this only to things which can be demonstrated to arise only within spatio-temporal realities. So if such a thing exists, they would not be able to recognize it. If they want to say that God to us is an illusion, what they have to consider is whether the trivialities, the trivial revelations, the trivial knowledge which science gives us is not also an illusion. Because when you say illusion, you're comparing it to something else, which is supposedly not an illusion. Now, science definitely 100% does that, as I explain in this video. Science gives the world basically nothing, at least not in a transcendent sense. And they're proud of this. But what this means basically is you're defining reality as absurdity, as superficiality, as triviality, as basically nothing. And that's why when you see all these TV shows, and for example, on astronomy, and they talk about the universe's, the glories of the universe and the Crab Nebulae and black holes and all this stuff, and it's just so grand. It's so awe-inspiring. It's so incredible. But so what? Yeah, it is incredible within the scientific paradigm. It's as far as you can go when describing a reality that is awe-inspiring. But you have to think, are these things really transformative? Are they really revolutionary? Is it really something that is explanatory over the full extent of what we can imagine to be reality? That is still up for debate. Look, the period of the orbit of a body around an exoplanet 200 light years away is the most trivial thing that you could possibly imagine. It has nothing whatsoever to do with us. It doesn't affect us. It doesn't change economies. It doesn't change philosophy. It doesn't change any of our spiritual outreach beyond our world and truly beyond our planet in a truly transcendent sense. They are speaking of a form of transcendence, but it's still within spatio-temporal reality. Basically, science gives the world a lot when it comes to the carnal things, when it comes to nuclear medicine, when it comes to lasers, when it comes to rockets, health. But these things are all temporal and imminent things. And it can't give us any more than that. And it can't make pronouncements on any more than that. So the problem with science, if something exists in the world, that is present in the world now, that demonstrates that some kind of transcendent power that is above it, that can see beyond it, that is in control of it, and that perhaps created it, is in the world, that we can examine rationally, intellectually, factually, that suggest very strongly and reasonably that this transcendent power and authority exists, then it really puts science in its place. Science cannot be put in its place. The one thing you have to understand about humanity is that the interior world of the mind is its own kingdom, and it's always going to be. Nothing is ever going to attract it out of that unless something out of that attracts it. Something outside the immanence of spatio-temporal reality, the reality inside the mind, the power of the mind to create concepts and theories and speculate. Those are all immanent things, and they're all locked unless something from the outside comes in and lets them know that something else exists. And they should perhaps turn their attention there before they make pronouncements on the entire scope of reality.